I didn't know it when we planted Presence Church that I was going to get to speak Spanish every Sunday, but really grateful for our Spanish speakers in our church and their willingness to make an English-speaking church their home. It's a really beautiful thing to see God bring together people from different backgrounds and cultures and environments and even people of different languages. Really grateful for that. You know, many of us carry shame quietly, believing lies about who we are and fearing rejection from others, feeling like we're only as valuable as our performance. And Unashamed, our new series, it's a 3-week journey toward truth, connection, and grace. And so we're going to study some scripture and look at some real-life applications that we can make as we learn how God dismantles shame and restores us from the inside out. And it's something that we don't talk about a lot in our culture, but shame tries to define us by who we are, by our weaknesses or our past or our pain. Anybody resonate with that today? That something from our past is defining who we see ourselves as today. But Jesus restores our identity and invites us to see ourselves through the truth of what God has done for us, not our limitations. There's an old hymn, and Susie and I, we grew up in a tradition where until about 2004, we only sang hymns, and we had a piano and an organ. And I don't miss only doing that, but I do at times miss some of the old hymns that the church used to sing. The melodies were beautiful, but the meaning, the theology of those hymns was so rich and deep. And there's an old one that goes like this: Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. What a beautiful song. It actually started as a poem written by John Newton in 1772. And the song is really about his life story, about where he moved from being a slave ship captain to an abolitionist pastor. The change in this man's life, going from a life of darkness and depravity and facing a storm in the middle of the night off the coast of Ireland in 1748. He said a prayer for the first time since childhood, and something shifted in his heart. And he would still remain in the slave trade for a number of years after that, but a transformation began in his life that night. Something broke inside him as he saw the fragility of his own life and his need for something greater. You know, Jesus, he often would rattle people's cages when he walked the earth in the first century. We talk about this a lot around here, that Jesus, he had some people in his life that just didn't like him. Did anybody have somebody in their life that doesn't like you? Okay, if you're not raising your hand, you either don't want to admit it or you just don't realize it. But trust me, that's not true. I'm the unlikable one in our family. Everybody loves Susie. Nobody doesn't like Susie. And, Jesus, he would find himself in these situations where these guys, the Pharisees, they were one of the religious groups of the day, people that thought they were really righteous. And they were always trying to trap him in something. And in today's reading, we're going to be in John chapter 9. We're actually going to read the entire chapter of John chapter 9. So if you brought your Bible, turn there, or you can tap or click to get there on your phone. We're going to read the entire chapter together today and see a story of a man who was born blind but would come to see. And Jesus uses this as an opportunity to rattle those Pharisees' cages again. Look at verses 1 and 2. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, which means teacher, Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? What does that question reveal to us about their culture? They were a shame-based culture. And there's many cultures even still today in our modern world that are shame-based cultures, where really value and respect, it's all about not dishonoring the family, right? It's all about not dishonoring your community. And this is the kind of culture that they lived in the first century. And so this man who was begging was just known as the blind beggar. It had become his identity. He was blind, and so he wasn't able to work. So all he could do was beg people for support, for help. And there were not the same social systems in place then that there are now. And so he would just be out in the streets and in the marketplaces and asking people for money to help him. And everybody that walked by started their evaluation of that person, of this man, with this question: why is he blind? Now, this is a question I would ask. You know, we ran into a situation. We did our taxes this past week, and we use an online platform. You know, we used to pay a ton of money for somebody else to do it. And so last year, we found an online platform we liked. It was less expensive, and it worked out okay. And so we went back to it this year, and at the top corner, it does this really unhelpful thing by telling you how much you still owe in taxes as you work through your return. We get all the way down to the end, and we owed $10,000 in taxes. And we're both shocked, like, we got this figured out, right? And so I don't understand why this is happening to us. And you know the question that I asked? Why? This man is born blind. What question do the disciples ask? Why? When you stub your toe in the morning trying to get ready for work, what's the question you ask after some colorful language? Why? When you hit unexpected traffic and you're running late and things just seem to be snowballing in life, what do you ask? Why? When terrible things in your life happen and you face the darkest moments, what do you ask? Why? And this is what the disciples are asking, but it also gives this indication of how people's identity was established in the first century. You see, this man must have been a sinner, or his parents must have been a sinner, and that's why things aren't going right in his life. Have you ever been in a spiritual environment where whenever something goes wrong in your life, you're afraid to say it out loud because you're worried the people around you are going to go, what'd you do to deserve that? I've been in some of those environments. And my guess is anybody that's been a follower of Jesus for any length of time has been in some of those environments too. And so the disciples are just working through the culture that they've been raised in. And it's even a religious culture, as we'll see as the story goes on. Verse 3 says, "It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins," Jesus answered. "This happened so the power of God could be seen in him." So what you're telling me is, no one's really to blame. This just kind of happened. But God is going to use it to do something significant. And it's something really powerful about that, isn't there? Because we ask this question, why, when things go wrong in our lives, and it's a fair question. I think God has heard it literally hundreds of billions of times in the history of the world, right? Why, God, why? And I think, feel better when you begin to recognize that the pain we experience has a purpose. You know, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I'm going to make an admission to you this morning. When I woke up, the rain outside, and just tired this morning, and it was cold, I pulled those covers up over me and hit the snooze, and I was like, man, I'm staying here all day long. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm really thankful all of you are far more spiritual than your pastor because you came to church today with smiles on your face. It was tough to get here today. But you know what? Some of those days come, and I share that during our pre-service prayer time, sitting right over there with a couple of guys. And I just said, man, this is, how I feel, but I feel compelled not to pray prayers to relieve the fatigue I feel or whatever it is, the fog or the funk that I was in today. In this season of my life, I felt compelled not to pray prayers of relief for how I'm feeling or what I'm experiencing, but instead to ask God to give me the grace to endure it faithfully. And so when we face these difficult times, we can recognize there is something in it for us, that there is an opportunity for the power of God to work in our lives. And that's what Jesus says is about to happen in this man's life. And here's a phrase that we need to get. In fact, we're going to put it on the screen, and we're going to leave it on the screen. It was important for this man to know, and it's important for us to know. You are not who shame says you are. You are not who shame says you are. You are not who society says you are. You are not who your deepest, darkest fears and concerns and flaws say you are. And this man's about to find out that very thing. And I love this about Jesus because he just shows up. He just shows up. And this man had spent his entire life begging. We don't know exactly how old he was. We know he was of a mature age. He was seen as an adult in the Jewish culture, which means he was at least 13 years old. But the likelihood is he was more like in his 20s, scholars say, though we don't know that 100% for sure. He had spent his entire life to this point blind and defined by his blindness. But look at what Jesus does in verse 4. He says, we must quickly carry out the tasks assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I'm here in the world, I am the light of the world. What's Jesus saying? Very simply, we got to be on mission. We got to be on mission for the work that the Father has called us to. Verse 6, then he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. Man, I was so inspired by this. We're going to do an old-fashioned healing service. You guys ready? Everybody that needs physical healing, I want you to get in line. And I have this cup of dirt, and I've been really saving my saliva. No, nobody's lining up. This is crazy. Why on earth did Jesus spit in the dirt and make mud? And it's kind of gross, isn't it? But remember how Jesus likes to rattle cages and do things in weird ways? And have you ever experienced that in your life? I'm here today because Jesus rattled my cage for a long time to get us to plant a church. And there's so many different times in my life I can look at God doing something that made zero sense. In 2012, we had a handshake agreement to go plant a church in Bakersfield. And then they strung us along for 6 months and eventually said, now we're going to go a different direction. Why? We had invested in that community. We had been going down 3 out of 4 weekends every month for close to a year, building friendships and relationships and building relational equity to plant this church. And in the end, they said no. And it was in that moment I basically gave up my dream of being a pastor, feeling called to vocational ministry. I just gave it up. But you know what? The power of God was at work in our lives. It was just in different timing than what I wanted. And this man experienced that very same thing, a different timing in his life. He had been begging God for this, right? I can imagine he's sitting on the street and he's got a hand out and he hears people walking by and he's saying, hey, can you help? Can you help? I'm blind. Can you help? I can't work. Can you help? And at the same time begging God, why is this happening to me? Would you give me my sight? And so this man is restored by Jesus. He gets his sight for the first time in his life. Now think about what he takes in on that day, the very first time able to see the brilliance of color, the light and the shadows, the depth that he's seeing for the first time. Now think about what this is doing in his life. He goes from someone who is defined by brokenness, defined by his disability, to someone who now has hope. Hope for a family, hope for a career, hope for contribution to their society. What a beautiful day for him when his eyes were opened, like John Newton, when his eyes were opened on that slave ship that was being tossed by the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. And I'm wondering, what do your eyes need to be open to today? What do my eyes need to be open to today? Is there some aspect of our lives where we need to recognize that we are not who shame says we are? But we can live, like Dr. Rob Reamer says, as truly loved sons and daughters of God. Verse 8. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said he was, and others said, "No, he just looks like him." But the beggar kept saying, "Yes, I'm the one." They asked, "Who healed you? What happened?" So he told them, "The man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes." Isn't it really interesting? He just says he made mud. Do you think he realized it was Jesus' spit that he used to make mud? That's why you should read the Bible. It's really funny and interesting. And so he says it was Jesus. He made mud, spread it over my eyes, and said, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." And so I went and washed, and now I can see. "Where is he now?" they asked. And "I don't know," he replied. Then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. This is like when something big in your life happens and you're like, I don't even know what to do with this. Who do we talk to? And so they went to see the Pharisees. They were thought to be the best of the best, the highest in Jewish society, the most intelligent, the most connected to God. And so they needed like some advice and some counsel, but it doesn't quite go the way that they think it's going to go. So they take him to the Pharisees. Because Jesus, it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. The Pharisees asked the man about it, so he told them he put mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. Now, the Pharisees, again, they're always looking for ways to try to trap Jesus and catch him, get him in trouble. And so to them, it appears that Jesus has broken the Old Testament law that you shouldn't work on the Sabbath. So for them, is how you define work, right, is what they were trying to do, is define work in such a way that Jesus broke the Sabbath law here. And so now the Pharisees, verse 16, some said, "This man is not from God, for he's working on the Sabbath." But others said, "How could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs?" So there was a deep division of opinion among them. And I love the idea here that now there's some of the Pharisees. I spent a lot of my time standing right here talking about how religious the Pharisees were. But the reality is there were some among the Pharisees, they truly loved God and were pursuing God. And they just were kind of stuck in this sect called the Pharisees. And like there was this heavy religious spirit there, but not everybody that was a part of that felt this religious spirit. It's like when somebody walks away from church because somebody at church was really mean to them and they blame the whole church. That's not the whole church. It was just some people in the church. It's kind of that same dynamic. And some of these Pharisees, their eyes are beginning to open to the reality that Jesus may just be who he says he is. And so the story goes on. In verse 17, then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, "What's your opinion of this man who healed you?" The man replied, I think he must be a prophet. I think he's from God. He's got to be, right? The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man and the man that had been blind and could now see. So they called in his parents. They asked them, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see?" And his parents replied, "Well, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he came to see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, "He's old enough. Ask him." So his parents, they've been threatened along with everybody else in that synagogue that if you choose to follow Jesus or you say he's something that we don't say he is, we're going to cast you out of the synagogue. Now, for us today, we're like, yeah, whatever. There's 1,000 churches in my neighborhood. I'll just go to the next one. That's not how life was in the first century in the Jewish culture. You were locked into that city, to that synagogue. Those were your people. They were your ride or die, whether you liked them or not. That was it. And so if you got cast out, you were now on your own. You had to deal with Rome. And now you'd have to deal with your old Jewish friends who have cast you out. And you're essentially like dead to them, right? So his parents, they don't like that idea. And so they kind of like pass the buck, right? Like, he's old enough, ask him. And we'll see what happens. And so that's what they did. Verse 24. So for the second time, they called in the man who had been born blind and told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man Jesus is a sinner. And here's the key passage. This is the key verse in this entire chapter, verse 25. I don't know whether he's a sinner, the man replied, but I know this. I was blind, and now I can see. I was blind, but now I can see. What a beautiful idea. He was blind, but now he can see. But what did he do, they asked. How did he heal you? Look, the man exclaimed, I told you once. Didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Oh man, you want to upset the Pharisees. That's going to get you kicked out of class. Verse 28 says, then they cursed him and said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. You hear the self-righteousness in that? We're disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know where this man comes from. Why, that's very strange, the man replied. Okay, let's notice here the boldness in the blind man. You know, when people ask me, like, Pastor Chris, you're a pastor. You're really good at the sharing your faith thing, right? I don't know. And then they say, well, how do I share my faith? I'm like, well, I don't like get into theological arguments with people generally. I don't know if people want to fight about theology, like we can, but that to me is not a conversation that's going to really lead to someone going from no faith to believing in Jesus, right? Instead, I just tell them my story. And this is what the blind man is doing here, right? He's telling his story. And I think the boldness he has is because his conviction is in what he experienced in the presence of Jesus. And so he's not arguing theology with this group of men who are skilled theologians in the Old Testament law. Instead, he's arguing his experience with Jesus, and there's a boldness. He says, why, that's very strange, the man replied. He healed my eyes, and yet you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. You know, so often I get in these dark spaces, and I don't remember Jesus' resume in my life. I don't remember the things that he's done for me. But this man right here, well, he's in it. He knows what he just experienced Jesus do for him. And he is not going to let anybody stand in the way of what he has done. And so the Pharisees reply, you were born a total sinner. They answered, and are you trying to teach us? So they threw him out of the synagogue. Don't you love when somebody asks you like your opinion and then they tell you your opinion's wrong? Right? Like, what happened? Tell me your story. Nah, that's not what happened. And so they give this guy the boot from the synagogue. They say, you're out. You're no longer a part of us. When Jesus heard what happened, he found the man and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You have seen him, Jesus said. Oh, he just said to a formerly blind man, you have seen him. Don't miss that. You have seen him. May God open our spiritual eyes to see him, that we might see Jesus. Jesus says, you've seen him, and he's speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said, and he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see they are blind. You are not who shame says you are. That's why Jesus came, Jesus came because you and I don't have to be defined by our sin. We don't have to be defined by our brokenness. We don't have to be defined by our fears or our limitations, but we can live as fully loved sons and daughters. I had that nightmare this morning. I woke up at 5 o'clock and realized I didn't set my alarm. Like, oh, man, thank you, Jesus, for waking me up. But 5's a little early, so I went back to sleep for a little bit. And I had like the scariest, most horrible nightmare this morning that I've maybe ever had in my entire life. And it was that, like, naked in front of people kind of a dream. I did have shorts on, but I was shirtless and in my, like, sleeping shorts. You know what I'm talking about? The outfit none of us ever talk about, that only our spouses see and our kids on their unlucky days get to see. And my shirt, I left my shirt on the chair in the front pew. And so I was, like, freaking out. How do I get to the front and get my shirt on without anybody seeing me with no shirt on? And, it was horrible. The whole day fell apart. And I woke up with like this sense of existential dread about the whole day. Like my whole life was crashing because I had this terrible dream. But you know what? Even though, and I don't know if it was my psyche, if it's just overall fatigue, if it's spiritual warfare, whatever it was, all of those secret fears about my limitations came forward in my mind. But you know what? I am not who shame says I am. I'm not those things. I am who Jesus says I am. And one of the most important things we do as followers of Jesus in walking our faith journey is baptism. And we see here this man not being baptized, but he is making a public proclamation of his faith in Jesus. He's been kicked out of the synagogue, and he's okay with that because he said, hey, it's worth it to follow you, Jesus. It's worth it to see you. And baptism is what we do in the modern day church. It's what they did in the first century as well. But it is what we do to publicly declare our faith in Jesus, to say, hey, I have seen him and I've accepted him as my Savior. I'm choosing to follow Jesus with my life. And baptism is this picture of that declaration. It's a picture of the process we go through as we begin a relationship with Jesus. And so Jesus was buried in a tomb and was raised to new life. And baptism is a picture of that. Going below the water is like the burial, identifying with Jesus and his burial. And we come up out of the water of baptism to identify with his resurrection. And it's a proclamation to all of the world that we are a follower of Jesus. And we're celebrating baptisms in just a few weeks. May 3rd, Sunday, May 3rd, we're going to celebrate baptisms, both services, and it's going to be an awesome day. So for those who have made a decision to follow Jesus and want to take this next step, just scan this QR code and fill out the form. And our team would love to just follow up with you and have some conversations. If you're interested, but maybe not 100% sure it's the right next step, just fill out the form, because one of our team will reach out and can answer any questions that you might have about baptism. And maybe for some, you're thinking, man, I haven't seen Jesus yet. Maybe this isn't the right next step for you, but there is a next step for you. And that is simply to just release control of your life to Jesus, like this man did when he experienced him. After Jesus answered this man and he talked about those that think they can see but are actually blind, turns out some Pharisees were standing nearby. These guys were like cockroaches. They were everywhere. Some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, "Are you saying we're blind?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty. But you remain guilty because you claim you can see." And, Jesus was always hardest on those that thought they were the most righteous. And my desire is that I just try to remain humble before the Lord. And it's not easy. It's a hard thing. But to live life open-handed, to release our lives to Jesus, to recognize that maybe I am blind, maybe these principles of life that I've just had this grip on for so long. Places that I've anchored my life are insufficient. There's a God out there that loves me deeply, that wants to walk with me, that wants to transition me from death to life. Maybe it's the hang up where we think like, I've done so much wrong in my life. I've doubted so much. I've been to prison. I've been to jail. I mean, whatever. Think about John Newton. John Newton was like the epitome of an evil human being, helping to kidnap and to sell people into this life of slavery and torture and pain. But God did something in his life. God changed him deeply on the inside, made him a poet of words that would later become this beautiful hymn that we would sing for hundreds of years, this song of freedom in the Lord. So I just want to give you an opportunity to recognize that you are not who shame says you are. You are who Jesus says you are. And he says you're beloved. And he stands with arms wide open, wanting to welcome you into the family. If you'd like to do that today, the prayer is very simple. It's literally the posture of your heart more than it is your words. It's to just say to Jesus, with all the faith I can muster today, I believe in you. That I recognize that my efforts are insufficient. Would you save me? Would you lead my life? Prayer is that simple. But the change that happens in our eternity and in our today is profound. I want to invite you to stand. And our worship team's going to lead us in just a moment of response. And perhaps right now is that moment you want to pray that prayer. For others in the room, maybe the Lord is speaking something to you about shame, about your value, about the way you've been living, about the filters through which you frame your life. If you walk away with nothing else today, I want you to walk away with the realization that you are not who shame says you are. Maybe even in this moment, as we just close our eyes and bow our heads, just meditate on that thought. I am not who shame says I am. I am not who shame says I am. Jesus, would you bring us freedom today? You know what each of us needs to hear. You know the words that will break our hearts wide open. You know the touch we need from you to open our eyes to see you. Even on days when we didn't want to get out of bed and we didn't want to go to church, we didn't maybe even want to be around people or just have the energy for the day. Maybe there's a fear in our lives. Jesus, you know exactly what we need to hear, the emotion we need to feel, the picture we need to see in our mind, the memory we need to think about. Would you set this truth in our hearts today that we are not who shame says we are. We are who you say we are. Would you set our identity in you? And would you help that identity to travel the 18 inches or so from our mind into our hearts? That it would be set deep within our souls, within our spirits, that we would experience the true freedom that only you can bring. Jesus, like John Newton, who was spiritually blind and received sight, like this man who was physically blind and received sight, you can do anything. You can heal anything, physical, emotional, spiritual. psychological. Jesus, you care about the whole of our being. And your desire is for us to have a full life lived with you. And we thank you for that. Thank you that you crossed the great divide of time and space because you love us, because you want a relationship with us, because you care for us. And you are undeterred by our sin, by our brokenness, by our past. You are undeterred by our limitations, or even the things that we have thought or said about you in the past. They do not keep you from pursuing us. So would you speak today?